The Last Stop. By Jeppe Brock Anderson. Chapter 1. The year 1949. The cold early morning breeze whipped Jolene's blonde curls as she pulled her daughter along. She walked fast. Not much thought was put into how uncomfortable it was for the child. She hissed, knowing she was late. Her blue eyes moved from one end of the Chicago Union Station to the other, searching for who to talk to. People moved around her, all going about their business. The crowd moved as if everyone was in a hurry to go somewhere, as if the train would leave them behind if their feet were not quicker. Jolene pulled on her daughter, Grace, with one hand. The child's hair was tied in a tail while Jolene let hers down like golden cascade down her shoulders. The child was like a tiny copy of her mother. Same blue eyes that seemed almost always curious and bouncy blonde hair. Grace tried to scratch the residue of sleep from her eyes. Her mother had pulled her out of the clutches of sleep too early in the morning, and now her body was revolting. Under her arm, she held tightly to her stuffed teddy, its shiny black eyes covered to the world. She looked around now as the station's lights spilled on the people walking around her. She stared at the high roof with awe and watched people around with tired expressions. The building buzzed with conversations and hollering, and she could hear a woman calling a boy's name somewhere behind her. It was all amazing to her. She rarely saw things or people like this. The mere stretch of the building, the smell of coffee and cigarette and colors. She couldn't wrap her sleep-fogged head around everything. She tried to pull her hands away from her mother's grip, but Jolene tightened her hold and gave her a brief look before hasting towards a man. The man had a black cap on his head and a uniform that told Grace he was the ticket seller. He puffed smoke and then tossed the butt of his cigarette on the ground before killing the light out with his heel. He looked up at Jolene, his eyes were lidded, and his face had a stern frown. "How can I help you, miss?" he asked. His voice made Grace hold tighter to her mother, but Jolene gave him a polite smile before speaking.
"I would like to know when the next train is moving and where to, please,"
Jolene said. The man shook his head. "I am afraid there is no train leaving the station for another hour, ma'am. Except for the one going to California. Unfortunately, it is completely booked." When he looked at Jolene, he didn't seem sorry for that, but his eyes had softened. She sighed and looked behind her as if expecting someone. The man looked at Grace, a small smile showing his teeth. Grace looked away just as Jolene looked back at the man.
"Is there no way you could let us join the train going to California?"
Jolene asked. She tried to mask her desperation. The creases of worry were smoothing when she smiled. The man regarded her for a moment and sighed. Jolene imagined he had been in situations like this one many times. His face didn't even reflect that he was tempted by her beauty or show interest in her as a woman. He shrugged. "The second class is all booked, but I think we can get you somewhere in the first class," he said, then he stared straight into her eyes. "You can get in there, but it is expensive." Jolene grinned and nodded. She dropped the bag in her other hand that had their clothes and reached into her purse.
"I have money, sir."
The man looked at the money and then at Jolene. For a few seconds, there was silence, and then the man sighed again, as if tired. He peeled the tickets out and held them out to her. Jolene took them with a thankful nod. "The train leaves in 10 minutes, the man said. Jolene nodded again and expressed her thanks as she guided Grace toward the platform. The air had turned from cold to warm as people clustered as they waited to board. They didn't have to wait long, though. The conductor was a man with a tight voice and a small frame. He waved his arms as he called for everyone to board. Behind him, the train puffed black smoke. The man's voice went from tight to impatient as people began to board. When Jolene and Grace made it to the board, he climbed on the train and gestured for Jolene to give Grace to him. She lifted Grace to him, and then he lifted her into the train the rest of the way.
I am sorry about the bother.
Jolene said, and the man waved her apology away with a smile. She smiled back. He was a young man, maybe 23. His red hair looked too good to be real, and his smile seemed practiced. His rows of teeth were perfect except for the one missing incisors. And who do we have here? The conductor said as he looked down at Grace. The conductor chuckled and patted her head softly. Grace stiffened as the man's eyes peered at her. She pulled on her mother's arm and hid behind her. The conductor laughed and shook his head as Jolene pulled Grace along when he opened the door for them. As they walked away, Grace looked back to find the conductor still watching them, still smiling. Then he waved before disappearing behind the people getting on the train.
Honey, you can walk on your own now.
Jolene said. A door opened to reveal a kitchen carriage. Grace stared at everything. A sweet smell wafted towards them as they walked through the carriage. The red and gold carpets, table, and porcelain wares made it seem like she was in a storybook. Grace wanted to stop and look at the carriage some more. She wanted to look closely at the lamps, feel the seats and touch the lush gold in the carpets. Everything amazed her. She had spied the kitchen briefly and had decided that was where the aroma was coming. Jolene hurried them through the carriage. They opened the door at the end, which led them into a corridor. Then on to the first-class carriage. Grace was shocked to a stop when she entered the carriage. A couple had their hands around each other and were lost in a kiss they were having. The woman's dress had a plunging neckline that showed the top of her breasts. Grace turned back as she walked further into the carriage. Her mother was behind, sauntering as she tried to find their compartment. Grace walked forward. Her eyes wandered from one compartment to the other. There was a dark priest in one. His glasses reflected the light as he read the Bible. He didn't look up as Grace passed. An older man was in the next one. His black vest seemed too big for him, and his gray hair looked regal. He had a fedora set up on his knee, and he rubbed the crown as if removing dirt. The older man was looking out the window as the train moved. She stopped at the next one. Two men were at work pulling something apart and storing the parts in a suitcase. She couldn't be sure, but the men looked like they worked in an office and what they took apart looked like those big guns in movies. She was about to move when another man shocked her with his presence. It seemed almost as if he appeared from nowhere. The shock made her drop her teddy and stagger back a few steps. The man looked down at her, his eyes creased when he smiled. His frame covered her view, and there was something scary in how he stared at her. "Sorry about that. How are you?" The man chuckled. Grace couldn't speak. She had been taught never to go snooping, and now she was in trouble. The man didn't look like he was angry, but adults were never easy to understand. She stayed still, waiting for her mother. The man's eyes were pool blue, almost pure. His smile widened, and he lowered himself a bit. "What is your name?" he asked.
Grace.
She stuttered. The man nodded, still smiling. "That is a lovely name you got there, Grace." "Mine is Jerry, not as beautiful as yours," the man said, and a smile teased Grace's lip. The man laughed. "How old are you?" Jerry asked.
6.
Grace answered, now smiling. Jerry's brows shot up in surprise. "Wow. 6. You are all grown up, ma'am." Grace laughed at how dramatic Jerry was when he bowed slightly for her. Jerry was about to say something when Jolene appeared behind Grace. "Come on, Grace. Don't bother the nice man," Jolene said as she steered her daughter away. Jolene gave him an apologetic smile, and Jerry nodded back, still smiling. He watched the mother and daughter go until they vanished inside a compartment. Jolene sighed when the door locked behind them. She felt relieved and then jolted when Grace's call snapped her out of whatever trance she was about to slip into. "Look," Grace said, her eyes watching the world outside through the large window. The compartment was like a small hostel. It had 2 beds and 1 table, and 2 chairs on opposite sides of the table. Jolene opened the restroom and peered inside, then locked it and turned to her daughter. Grace shrieked with delight as the cityscape quickly vanished, and they could see hills and greens of forests. The sky stretched endlessly into the blurring horizon. She sat down and sighed. Finally safe, she thought. You can find The Last Stop on Amazon now. Chapter 2. Jerry watched until he could not see them anymore before he stood up. As he turned to go back inside, his eyes caught the blank stare of the teddy on the floor. He picked it, turned it around, and then chuckled. "You think they saw us?" Jerry turned to the worried eyes of the other man inside the compartment. Colm stared back at him, his eyes wide with concern. Jerry's sweet flip-flop sensation roared when he saw the girl's mother vanish. The smile eased a bit, and he crashed back to reality. The inside of their compartment looked small because of the men inside. All 3 of them looked young in one way or the other. Jerry could boast of being 28 even though he was past 35. Colm was always frowning either because he was scared, angry, or just resting his face. He looked older than his 36, but his steps were fast as any agile man in his 20s. "Calm the fuck down, Colm. We are doing fine," Jerry said. He looked at the teddy again, and the woman's face flitted through his mind. Colm looked unconvinced. The Winchester shotgun was still in the suitcase. He had hidden it in immediately after hearing Jerry talking to the little girl. "How do you know?" "She might have. You might want to scream louder, Colm." Jerry cut him off, and Colm rolled his eyes dramatically. The third man, Howard, chuckled. He had a half-gone cigarette in his mouth. He shook his head at Jerry and Colm while he went about what he was doing before. "I just want to make sure we are not getting ourselves in trouble," Colm said, smoothing his slick side waves. His black hair shone. Jerry nodded, still looking at the teddy. He was half expecting the kid to return for the teddy or maybe the mother. "Take it easy now, Colm," Howard said. His yellowing teeth bared in a smile. Colm glared at him, and Howard chuckled. Colm's mustache wiggled as it was wont to do when he was annoyed or agitated. Howard shook his balding head and sighed. He was the oldest in the group and the ugliest. Aside from his balding head, he had a large scar on his lower lip. The rest of him was muscular and masculine. Jerry shook the teddy in Howard's face. "I will give this back," he said when Howard looked at him. Howard hissed and nodded. "Don't get lost." "Hurry back," Howard said, and Colm made a comment that Jerry didn't catch. Howard's hollering laughter faded as Jerry walked down the corridor. He could vaguely remember where they had vanished. He counted the doors, and when he got to the right one, he pushed the door open and peered. Jerry stopped, his mouth hanging slightly open at what he was seeing. A nude woman was positioned on all fours. Her back and breasts were slick and shiny with sweat. Her eyes met his, and her lips broke into a tight, delightful smile. "What the hell, man?" Jerry turned to see the man positioned behind the woman. He had a hat on, but aside from that, all Jerry could see was pale skin. The woman chuckled. "I am so sorry," Jerry said, still stunned by how the woman's black hair seemed to stick to her back, and when he got to where they were both joined, he heard the man groan when the woman wiggled her ass.
You can join us if you want.
The woman said, and the man behind her cursed. "Shut up, Mary," the man said to her, annoyed. He turned and glared at Jerry. Jerry blinked and nodded, realizing what he should have done minutes ago. He locked the door back inside, shaking his head to dispel what he had seen. Then he walked forward and stopped at another door he felt was the right one and knocked. The door opened, and when he saw the face, his chest tightened, and a slow smile crept up his face. How wondrous, he thought. It was astonishing. I am sorry to disturb you, miss.
Jolene. Jolene Hill.
Jolene said with a small polite smile. Jerry nodded. Hello, Miss Hill, Jerry said and waved the teddy. He looked behind Jolene. The door wasn't completely opened, but he could see the kid behind the mother. The girl's eyes brightened when she saw the teddy. Teddy! The girl screamed, her smile wide and her arms stretched as she squeezed past her mother to pluck the teddy from Jerry's hand. They both watched Grace hug the teddy, and Jerry chuckled.
Thank you, Mr.
Jolene waited for Jerry to give her his name, and Jerry caught on slowly. Morgan, Jerry finished at last. Jerry Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan.
Jolene said. This time her smile was genuine. Jerry made a faux bow, and Jolene chuckled. Not a problem, Jerry said. And please, call me Jerry. Jolene nodded.
Then it is Jolene to you.
Jerry's smile widened as if she had kissed his cheek rosy. I like that, Jolene. There was a short silence, and then, as if being pulled away by an invisible force, Jerry made himself say goodbye. As he walked away, he heard the door click shut. The kid's laughter still rang in his head. And that voice, Jolene to you. Jerry hummed as he returned to his cabin to meet Howard, still working on the guns and Colm snoring. He sat down, smiling, and got back to work. Watching the world they were leaving behind was fun, but soon Grace was hungry, and Jolene was tired of the box. They went out to look for food. They took the same trip backward until they were in the dining carriage with the red and gold carpets and the shiny porcelain. The others in the first-class carriage were out too. They were clustered at separate tables. The kissing couples were deep in a conversation, and the woman was smiling while the woman talked. The priest seemed wholly taken by the black cover Bible, and as Jolene and Grace passed him, they heard him murmur something. The other man had his fedora on, but some tufts of gray hair were showing. He looked away from the book he was reading and looked at Grace. They shared a smile briefly, and then he turned back to his book. They walked past Jerry and his two companions as they walked to a free table away from the other passengers. Grace ran her hands back and forth on the smooth leather covering the seats. It was soft and comfortable. Jolene made their order and waited for 10 minutes before the food came. The table, too, had a covering with flowers embroidered on it. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The sun was high up outside. Grace parted the curtain to see outside after eating. Jolene ate at a slow pace as if to appreciate the food better. Grace screamed when she saw something beautiful. She called her mother to see how colors flitted and blurred until it seemed like she was looking at streaks of colors and obscured green. Hello, Jolene. Jolene turned to see Jerry standing beside her table. His eyes were alight again, the blue shimmering as if too bright. His dirty blonde hair and side waves made him look like a TV host in a Saturday special.
Hi, Jerry.
Jolene said, smiling. Jerry gestured to the space beside her. You mind? He asked, and she shrugged and shook her head.
Of course not. Please, sit.
Jerry smiled, his eyes folding beautifully when he did. He sat beside her and pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He held one to her and then lit hers before lighting his own. Grace turned to them briefly and then turned back to the window. You are traveling alone with the little angel there? Jerry asked. Jolene smiled and nodded.
Quite a group you have there.
Yeah, we work together. Jerry left the end hanging and then blew smoke out before asking where she was heading.
California.
Jolene said. Grace jumped down from her seat and turned toward the others. As she walked away from the two of them, she heard her mother say something about new beginnings. She walked through, looking from one passenger to the next until she got to the older man. His face was covered with the book he was reading. Then he peered at her from the edge of the book.
What are you reading?
Grace asked. The man smiled, amused by her forwardness. It's about a man who finds himself, midway through life, in a severe crisis. Then a great poet leads him through hell and purgatory to finally reach paradise. Here he is spiritually united. What is your name? The man asked, smiling down at her. The book was resting on his thigh now. Grace smiled.
Grace.
That is a beautiful name, the old man said. Grace nodded, blushing.
Grace, who are you talking to?
Jolene called. Grace turned, shocked by her mother's voice.
No one.
She lied, turning to see her mother and Jerry looking at her. Can I tell you a secret? The older man whispered, and Grace turned to him. When she nodded, he gestured for her to come close, and then he leaned down and whispered in her ears. His voice was slow and sweet, and the air from his breathing tickled her ear. The man sat back up when he was done and smiled. Grace felt her mother's hand on her immediately, which startled her. She looked up to see her mother smiling down at her.
Come, Grace. Let's go back inside.
Grace waved goodbye to the man as they left, and he did the same. Now, she could see it. His eyes were gray, almost ash, and hair was in each nostril. He smiled and the freckles scattered all over his nose and under his eyes gathered. End of chapter. You can get the book now. On Amazon. Chapter 3. Grace sang as the train moved. She tried to catch patterns of trees and birds as the train left them behind. Jolene took a quick nap. She felt the onset of a headache, like a slight throbbing waiting to explode. She could not wait to get out of the train, but more than that, she was happy the farther they got away from the city. When Jolene swung her legs off the bed and turned to look at Grace, the view had changed. The green haze of trees and woods passed as the train began rising towards a steep mountain hillside leveled for the tracks.
Mom, come look.
Grace giggled and pointed. Jolene pushed off the bed and pressed her face to the window beside her daughter. The train was approaching a bridge. The bridge was going on to another mountainside where a giant hole was bored. Jolene had heard about it, and now she was about to experience it.
Are we going to enter the mountain?
Grace asked, her teddy held tightly under her left arm. Jolene nodded, staring at the black hole getting more prominent as they got close. Then something caught her eyes above the hole. At the far top, she could see something rolling down. Before her mind could figure out what it was, the train ran into the dark hollow of the mountain. Jolene waited, her heart racing and her chest tight. She tried to breathe, not wanting her daughter to feel the fear rushing through her. No, not here.
Grace.
Jolene called, her voice shaking. She pulled Grace to her, sitting on the bed. It felt like seconds were stretching until everything started to happen too quickly. Jolene heard something crash down hard on the train somewhere behind them, and then the train shook. Jolene and Grace were almost thrown off the bed, but Jolene held on. Jolene stayed still, waiting to see if there would be another crash. Her body was stiff with apprehension. Fear was gone, replaced with dread. Something made a long groan, and another jolt racked through the train when that ended. Grace screamed, and where Jolene held on, the iron cut her hand a bit. She could feel the sticky warmth of blood, but the pain meant nothing. She was numb. After that last bang, nothing happened. The train was silent. Grace was crying, but Jolene held her close. She couldn't let go. Her fingers were stiff, and her heart was hammering against her chest. Jolene couldn't shake the feeling that they had almost died. For a brief moment, she had regretted leaving, entering the train. She had wished she was back in the city.
Mom?
Grace called, sniffling. Jolene jolted from her thoughts. She couldn't see Grace clearly in the darkness, but she quickly let go of her grip. Her daughter slid down to the train floor and turned. Jolene held her bloody hand awkwardly. She would need to wrap it with something before getting first aid. She looked outside the window, and then she realized the glass didn't break. Lucky us. The pitch blackness wasn't helpful, though. She needed to know what had just happened. It had taken the crash for her mind to register what she saw rolling down the mountainside finally.
Are you all right, Grace?
Jolene asked, stretching to hold her daughter with her one good hand. Grace made a sound that Jolene wasn't sure was a confirmation. She touched her daughter's head and ran her hand over Grace's tiny body. She sighed when Grace didn't cry in pain. That was one trouble out of the way. Now they had to get out and look around. That last crash had seemed like something hit the train from behind. She put her head through the window, but she couldn't see much.
What happened?
Grace asked, her tiny voice innocent and curious. Jolene sighed and turned. Her hand was beginning to hurt. She hissed as she pulled Grace with the other hand.
I don't know, honey. I don't know.
Jerry bolted off his bed immediately after the crash happened. All signs of the sweet sleep he had been enjoying faded instantly. He was shocked by the darkness, but Colm's voice behind him stunned him even more. What the hell are you doing? Colm cursed. Jerry sighed. A small lamp light grew until Howard's face was illuminated. The worry on his face made his scar appear more significant, and the light so close to his face made him even uglier. Sorry, Jerry said to Colm. What was that? Jerry asked, directing his question at Howard and then looking out the window at the absolute darkness. Are you all right? Howard asked, the lamp still held up close to his face. Jerry nodded. He opened the door and then put his head out. Others were looking out too. Jerry came out and walked down to the dining carriage where everyone had gathered. He looked around, searching for familiar faces. The couple from earlier walked in. Jerry recognized the woman at once. She looked different, probably because she was still shaking from what had just happened. Jerry found Jolene and Grace sitting away from the crowd. The light in the carriage was not much, but Jerry saw Jolene's bandaged hands at once. She turned when he got closer. Grace was quiet, clinging to her mother. For some reason, Jerry wanted to pull the woman close. What the hell was that? Someone yelled. Jerry looked back to see the couple and the others trying to see what had happened outside. He turned back to Jolene.
Are you all right, Jerry?
Jolene asked as Jerry sat beside her. Jerry nodded. Grace peered at him briefly and laid her head on her mother's thigh. You got hurt?
Just a minor cut, nothing serious.
Jolene said. Her smile was not genuine, but Jerry nodded. You have any idea what happened? Jerry asked.
I saw it.
Jolene said.
I don't know why, but suddenly it started rolling down like a...
The conductor then walked out of a door, and the others in the carriage assaulted him with questions. They were loud and angry, and Jolene thought they would become violent for a moment. The conductor gestured for them to quiet down, and when a few of them complied, he began. I have gone through the other carriage. I think we are the only ones here. What the hell happened? The young man Jerry walked in on earlier asked. The conductor turned to him. What is your name, sir? Henry. Henry Foster. Right. Mr. Foster, it seems like the mountain split and rolled down on the train. The conductor seemed strained. His voice was tighter than usual, and he teetered towards the edge. He made an effort to be polite. And you want us to sit tight in this damn darkness until when? The end of times? The man asked. The conductor shook his head. Of course not, Mr. Foster. I apologize if it seemed like I was implying that. Help will come. The station in California will realize something has gone wrong soon. They will send rescue. The others murmured as the conductor turned and left them in the carriage. Jolene sighed. She looked down at Grace, who was now sleeping on her thighs. Jerry chuckled when he looked at Grace. Ah! To be a kid. Yeah, Jolene said.
She is always calm even when there is trouble.
She tried not to look at Jerry, not wanting the pity that would show in his eyes if he saw the tears in hers. She was tired of pity. She would like to be strong for a change. Norman sighed when he got out of the train. He shone his flashlight on the tunnel entrance and found it closed shut by debris and a bit smashed carriage. I hope no one was hurt there. There was nothing he could do about that. He could go to the engineer and see if there was anything they could do about the part of the train that wasn't wrecked. That would make more sense than standing about doing nothing but worry. The darkness in the tunnel seemed to swallow everything around the light. Norman's mind raced with different things that could go wrong. He moved his flashlight frantically, trying to cover every portion of the tunnel as he walked towards the leading carriage. Then he heard something, a scraping. His heartbeat intensified, and he felt an intense ache in his chest for a second. Norman took one step and froze when his breathing leveled, and his eyes didn't sting anymore. An ear-splitting sound rents the air. Someone, a woman, was calling for help. Norman turned, expecting others to race out of the carriage. No one did. Those scared cowards. Norman ran towards where the sound was coming. He couldn't decide where exactly it was, so he stopped in front of the first door he felt was right. He heard the scream again, and the rawness of the pain made him pause. Questions were running through his mind. He couldn't just run in there. What was happening? Maybe something fell on her. He put the torch up, and bile rushed up to his throat. Blood oozed out from the slit under the door. A lot of blood dripped down and made a large pool. The woman's voice changed. It became manic. As if the pain was consuming her mind. She cried and begged some more. Every sound felt like a scrape of metal on Norman's skin. He walked slowly towards the door. So much. So much blood. All of them. Are they all dead? His mind was going blank with despair. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that whatever he would find on the other side of the door would be horrific. Still, Norman pushed the carriage door open. He pulled himself up, and when he pointed his flashlight in, his heart dropped, and a guttural scream rushed out of him.